Welcome to this explainer. All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're unpacking a fundamental tension right at the heart of building high-growth tech ventures, and that is the science of startup teams. Because if you look at the empirical data, building a successful venture is rarely just about the technology itself. It's almost always about the people commercializing it. We're going to explore what the absolute latest state-of-the-art research tells us about team composition, the paradoxes of diversity, and how external investors actually evaluate the people versus the product. Okay, let's dive into this. We've got a fascinating scholarly journey ahead of us today, so here's our roadmap. We'll kick things off with the classic debate of solo versus team founding. Then we'll unpack the team diversity paradox. After that, we'll dive into the very specific dynamics of commercializing academic science, explore what influences external investment, and finally, we'll settle the ultimate venture capital debate, the jockey versus the horse. So, starting right off with our first great dilemma, the foundational choice between going it alone as a solo founder or building a co-founding team. According to the Idea Proof Complete Startup Team Comparison Guide, the distinct profiles and inherent trade-offs of this choice are incredibly clear. As a solo founder, you get to retain 100% of the equity and you can make decisions lightning fast. But you also bear 100% of the burden, and that means both the grueling workload and the emotional strain. On the flip side, bringing in co-founders gives you complementary skills and a shared emotional support system. But, as we're going to see, it introduces a massive risk of social friction. Now, when we look at the actual outcome data, a really fascinating performance paradox emerges. On one hand, solo founders actually have a 2.6 times higher chance of survival. They are just far less likely to dissolve the business entirely. But teams scale 3.6 times faster out of that early startup phase. Why? Well, simply put, teams have a much broader pool of human capital to draw from. It's a double-edged sword, though. Get this. A staggering 65% of startup failures are actually caused by people problems. We're talking co-founder conflict, equity disputes, you name it. To really understand why founders willingly take on that social risk, we can turn to Noam Wasserman's classic research in the founder's dilemmas. Wasserman famously frames this as the rich versus king dilemma. If a founder wants to be king, meaning they want total, unquestioned control, they almost always go solo. But founders who prioritize riches, those trying to maximize the actual financial value of the venture, they choose to be what he calls pack dogs. They embrace teamwork because, especially in complex technology and life science sectors, you absolutely need complementary technical and operational expertise to build a viable business. And that urgent need for complementary expertise brings us directly to our second section, the team diversity paradox. A fascinating study published in the Journal of Management and Organization took a hard look at the dark side of entrepreneurial team diversity. They basically did post-mortem analyses of failed startups. But to understand what they found, we first have to clearly define what we mean by diversity. First, you have surface-level diversity. This includes demographic traits like age and gender, plus informational traits like your education and professional background. Then you have deep-level diversity, which is all about personality, cognitive styles, and core values. Now, while diversity is universally known to spark innovation and help secure resources, this study reveals how it can actually act as a massive destabilizing force if you're not careful. And tracing this across the venture lifecycle shows us that the impact of team diversity isn't static at all. Startups are highly dynamic systems. The friction caused by these different types of diversity shifts dramatically as a venture moves from the ideation stage into product development and finally hits the launch stage. So the crucial takeaway here is that different stages break teams apart for completely different reasons. During ideation, it's cognitive friction that causes the most damage, people just having totally misaligned strategic visions. Then you get into product development, and it becomes informational friction. Think about the engineering team pushing for complex perfection, while the business side is just screaming for speed to market. And finally, during the launch stage, demographic friction, like significant age differences, amplifies tensions over risk preferences and how to execute under immense, crushing pressure. Understanding these incredibly nuanced team dynamics becomes even more critical in highly complex technological environments. So let's pivot to our third topic, how profound scientific discoveries are actually translated into commercial startups. We're pulling some amazing insights here from a brilliantly designed 2021 article by Matt Marks and David Hugh titled Revisiting the Entrepreneurial Commercialization of Academic Science. They were looking at a massive research problem. How do you honestly know if a team commercialized a discovery because the team was inherently great or just because the discovery itself was so obviously profitable? To solve this, they created an incredibly clever twin discoveries methodology. They analyzed 20,000 pairs of highly similar scientific papers. By doing this, they essentially held the nature of the scientific advance constant, which allowed them to isolate exactly what team characteristics drive commercialization. And their findings were just striking. They proved that even when the underlying science is functionally identical, the discoveries that actually make it out of the lab and into a real startup are driven by specific team compositions. Interdisciplinary scientific teams are far more likely to commercialize. And get this, if the team previously collaborated with a star serial entrepreneur, their chances of commercializing their own discoveries just absolutely skyrocket. Having that exposure gives them professional legitimization, market awareness, and the exact diverse networks they need to successfully make that massive leap from academia to entrepreneurship. Now, once a team finally decides to commercialize, they inevitably need capital. And that brings us to Section 4. Influencing external investment. The specific dynamic at play here is brilliantly captured in Blank and Carmelli's 2021 study, Does Founding Team Composition Influence External Investment? What they found is that a founding team's prior managerial and industry-specific experience powerfully and positively drives external investment events. Investors look at a team's track record as a direct signal of their capacity to identify market entry strategies and allocate resources without wasting them. The team's human capital literally acts like a magnet for outside funding. However, baked right into this dynamic is a classic principal-agent problem. It's a deep goal conflict within the venture itself. The executive team members, the agents, they want to use their impressive experience to attract funds because they know capital is required to make the startup's vision a reality. But the founder CEO, the principal, they actually have a completely conflicting motivation. You see, every single time a startup raises capital, the founder CEO dilutes their equity and loses a degree of managerial control. So while the broader team is pushing hard for investment to capitalize on market opportunities right now, the founder CEO actually tends to delay funding. Blank and Carmelli literally found an inverse relationship here. New ventures led by founder CEOs pursue a systematically lower number of external investment events compared to ventures led by professional, non-founder CEOs. The founders just want to retain their ownership and authority. This constant underlying tension between the founding team and the investors leads us perfectly to our final section, and honestly, perhaps the most famous debate in all of venture capital, the jockey versus the horse. We've spent this entire explainer looking at the profound impact of the team, but should investors actually be prioritizing them above everything else? In the landmark study, What Are Firms? Evolution from Birth to Public Companies, researchers Kaplan, Stromberg, and Sensoy posed this exact question. Do you bet on the jockey, the founders with those impressive credentials, or do you bet on the horse, the fundamental product and the market opportunity? The empirical data gives us a very nuanced but completely decisive answer. The jockey is absolutely crucial for early traction. A high-quality founding team is strongly associated with crossing those early, fragile milestones like raising that first $1 million. However, when it comes to massive scale execution, we're talking raising $10 million or $25 million plus and creating long-term enduring value. The data heavily favors the horse. Longitudinal studies of venture-backed firms show us that the initial business idea and the product market space remain remarkably stable over time, whereas the human capital, the management team, frequently changes or is completely replaced by investors. Professor Stephen Kaplan summarizes this perfectly, saying, "The glue holding the firm together at a very early stage is composed of the patents, the stores, and the processes. Except, perhaps, for raw startups, VCs should bet on the horse. We see the jockeys changing, but we don't see the horse changing. The core assets, the non-human capital, are ultimately what hold the maturing firm together." Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought. Building a technology venture requires navigating a maze of human paradoxes. You have the speed of the solo founder up against the scale of the team. You have the innovation brought by diversity battling the sheer friction it causes. You have the desperate need for capital versus the fierce desire for control. But ultimately, as the data clearly shows, the people may be temporary, while the asset is enduring. So, as you structure your next venture or evaluate a new investment, ask yourself, will you optimize for the team's harmony today or the asset's endurance tomorrow? Thank you for watching and keep learning.